Legacy media say that ICE arrested a 5-year-old, but is that really true? But on the other hand, the DOJ did arrest 3 people who stormed into a church and then proceeded to harass everybody in that church over their immigration policy. We'll get to all that in a moment. First, 3 years ago, Hollywood told fans they would never make a series about one of the most enduring stories ever told. And so we did. Not the fairy tale, an origin story, a series about power, sacrifice, and the Christian beliefs that shaped the West. Before Arthur, before Camelot, before the sword. This is the beginning. Yesterday, we released episodes 1 and 2 of the Pendragon cycle, Rise of the Merlin, and you showed up. This is premium storytelling without compromise. This is what Hollywood wouldn't make. Go to dailywireplus.com and start streaming the Pendragon cycle, Rise of the Merlin today. So amid all of the chaos regarding the immigration situation in Minneapolis, members of the legacy media have just started to tell lies. The latest lie that is being told is that federal agents seized a 5-year-old boy in an effort to bait his father. This story was first retailed, apparently, by the New York Times. The original report suggested a 5-year-old boy wearing a Spider-Man backpack and an oversized hat was detained with his father by immigration authorities on Tuesday, one of 4 students recently apprehended in a suburban Minneapolis school district, according to school officials. And this was treated by the legacy media as a major story. It was the lead on Drudge Report. There was a picture of this little boy wearing what appeared to be a Disney hat. And again, the idea was that he was used as bait, according to the Daily Mirror. The pre-kindergarten pupil, kid named Liam Conejo Ramos, was pictured in a photo released by the school system standing next to a vehicle with an adult's hand on his backpack. His father is not in sight. Zena Stenvik, the superintendent of schools in Columbia Heights, Minnesota, asked at a news conference why detain a 5-year-old. However, that is not actually what happened, as you could have predicted. According to the New York Times, again, they bury this further down in the story, the boy and his father were taken to Dilley, Texas, outside San Antonio, where they are being held at an immigration detention center, according to Mark Prokosh, a lawyer working with the family. The boy and his father came to the United States from Ecuador in 2024. Each has an active asylum claim. The image of the child in custody prompted an outcry. But what exactly happened? Well, again, according to Tricia McLaughlin, a spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security, when the agents sought to detain the father, he fled on foot, and he left Liam behind in the vehicle, which is a bit of a different story, as it turns out. If you're detained alongside your child and you take off and your kid is 5, well, that might say something about your parenting style, to say the very least. I have 4 children. One of them is 5 years old. The insanity of being detained alongside my 5-year-old daughter and just taking off is beyond measure. That is crazy. Apparently, Ms. Stenvik, the district superintendent, said in a statement that another adult who lived in the family's home had begged to care for Liam, but federal agents refused to allow it. Well, presumably one of the reasons why they had refused to simply allow an adult staying in the home to take care of the boy is they don't know who the adult is. In 2024, there was a report regarding the Biden administration that found that from 2019 to 2023, more than 32,000 unaccompanied migrant children failed to appear for their immigration court hearings. In fact, they lost track of tens of thousands of migrant children, some of whom were reunited with families, some of whom they really don't have an idea. And so, yeah, they might not be so hot on the idea of just dropping the 5-year-old with an adult who lives in the home. They don't know who the adult is. According to Tricia McLaughlin, the agents had tried to get Liam's mother to take the boy, but she had apparently refused. McLaughlin said that Conejo Arayos told federal agents he wanted Liam to stay with him. Ms. Granlund said Liam's father was yelling at adults inside the home, "Please do not open the door," presumably because of fears the agents would apprehend other people who are in the home and in the country illegally. Now, again, this has raised hackles because there is widespread debate over what sort of warrant is necessary, an administrative warrant or a judge-signed warrant, in order to enter a home where there's probable cause to believe illegal immigrants are residing. We'll get to that legal issue in a moment. School officials had previously accused immigration agents of making the child knock on the door of his home as bait so they could apprehend others, something that immigration officials denied. So, again, I cannot imagine that that is actually the case, that they just took a 5-year-old and they said, "We need you to knock on the door and call for mommy," in order to get into the house to go get illegal immigrants. In order to detain Liam against his will, agents would need probable cause to believe he was in the country unlawfully, but they are allowed to keep the child with an arrested parent if the parent requests it. Well, Vice President J.D. Vance was visiting at Minneapolis on Thursday, and here's what he had to say.
I see this story, And I'm a father of a 5-year-old, actually, a 5-year-old little boy. And I think to myself, oh my God, this is terrible. How did we arrest a 5-year-old? Well, I do a little bit more follow-up research. And what I find is that the 5-year-old was not arrested, that his dad was an illegal alien. And then when they went to arrest his illegal alien father, the father ran. So the story is that ICE detained a 5-year-old. Well, what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to let a 5-year-old child freeze to death? Are they not supposed to arrest an illegal alien in the United States of America? If the argument is that you can't arrest people who have violated our laws because they have children, then every single parent is going to be completely given immunity from ever being the subject of law enforcement. That doesn't make any sense. No one thinks that makes any sense.
Obviously, the vice president is obviously 100% right about all of this. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have had a serious problem on our hands since there was an agreement, a consent agreement between the federal government and various judiciary bodies, the Flores Agreement going back decades, that suggested that you could not hold a child and parent together in custody when they crossed the border, and so children were released into the interior of the country. And this caused the Biden administration, among other administrations, to release the parents as well, to reunify the family. Well, now the idea is that you can't deport anyone because they might have children. And so you can't reunify the family, even if the father wants to be with the kid. And then you get blamed if the father takes off when you hold the kid and the parent together. What exactly are immigration agents supposed to do? This, of course, makes everything unworkable, which I believe is the point. Now, some of this is part and parcel of a new ICE policy that suggests that there does not need to be a judge-signed warrant in order to enter the home. Again, you heard that mentioned in the story from the New York Times, that ICE agents are showing up at homes, and based on administrative warrants, they are entering homes, and they are looking for illegal immigrants. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration is asserting new powers to forcibly enter the homes of people they are hoping to arrest without a criminal warrant signed by a judge. Over the summer, lawyers at ICE and its parent agency, the Department of Homeland Security, penned a secret memo expanding the authority by which agents may enter homes of immigrants with final deportation orders, the people said. Now, what's happening here? Well, what they're saying is that is effectively a judge-signed warrant, or at least it's very similar. You have a deportation order. It has been signed by a judge, a final deportation order, and now they're using that as the predicate for the warrant. It is a civil warrant, not a criminal warrant. That is the basic argument that is being made. And when it comes to immigration enforcement, Supreme Court precedent suggests that administrative warrants issued by the attorney general rather than a judge could be utilized to arrest people pending deportation. And that was codified in the Immigration and Nationality Act, actually. Now, there are restrictions on it, like you're not supposed to enter a private home without consent. But again, the DHS has now said, well, maybe that changes because the final order of removal has already been signed. So the person's already had due process. It's not a matter of there has to be another judicial hearing in order to remove them. They already have a final order pending removal. And so once that order is already done, they've had their due process, and now it's just a question of executing the order. All of that will end up litigated in court, but to pretend that there is no legal basis whatsoever for what DHS and ICE are doing, that seems wrong. According to the Wall Street Journal, DHS and ICE officials have not publicized or broadly distributed the legal decision because they felt it would invite legal scrutiny. Immigration lawyers and advocates from Minnesota have documented cases of agents breaking down people's doors to arrest them without a warrant. But again, in some of these cases, you're talking about people who have overstayed their visas by legitimately 20 years. The most prominent case concerned a Minnesota man born in Liberia, whose Fourth Amendment right was violated by ICE officers when they broke down his door without his consent and without a judicial warrant. He was issued a deportation order in 2009. He was allowed to remain in the U.S. under ICE supervision. His most recent check-in with ICE was December 29th, 2025, and on January 11th, immigration officers forced their way into his home and took him into custody. They said they had a warrant. Apparently, this would be the administrative warrant. This will all get litigated in court. But the bottom line is this. There are plenty of situations that are going to be dicey when it comes to specific enforcement of general law. However, the media should not have to make things up like they found a 5-year-old boy and they used him as bait in order to go after his father. They shouldn't have to do that. And the fact that they are having to do that means that, again, the broad policy is largely inarguable, which is why you look for bad exceptions. Now, meanwhile, this sort of media coverage is leading to significant ire and rage in places like Minneapolis. It is ratcheting up the tensions with ICE. Again, the vice president was visiting Minneapolis, and he said, listen, the problem here is Minneapolis authorities, not ICE.
But the number one way where we could lower the mistakes that are happening, at least with our immigration enforcement, is to have local jurisdictions that are cooperating with us. There are some very basic things that would make Minneapolis look, Memphis, Tennessee, a blue city where you do not have this chaos in immigration enforcement because the local police and the local authorities are cooperating with us. So when you look at Memphis, Tennessee, or Austin, Texas, or any other community virtually across the United States of America, and you don't see the same level of chaos in Minneapolis, the natural conclusion is that it's not what ICE is doing in Minneapolis, it's what Minneapolis authorities are doing to prevent ICE from doing their jobs. And that's exactly what's happening.
And Vance, of course, is right about this too. I mean, the fact is that if local authorities were, in fact, working hand in glove with DHS, things would go a lot smoother. Vance also pointed out that protest does not mean assault. That if you're going to protest ICE agents, that does not mean that you can obstruct federal law or go after the ICE agents physically or threaten them.
A lot of these guys are unable to do their jobs without being harassed, without being doxxed, and sometimes without being assaulted. That's totally unacceptable. And that's one of the things that I want to send a message to is, yes, come out and protest me, protest our immigration policy, but do it peacefully. If you assault a law enforcement officer, the Trump administration and the Department of Justice is going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. And I wanted to show some support for these guys.
Now, again, when it comes to prosecuting people to the fullest extent of the law, the big story with regard to immigration over the past 24 hours is that now the DOJ is going after 3 people who essentially took over a church in the middle of a service in order to promote their immigration radicalism in violation of the FACE Act, which is an act that was designed to do 2 things. It was designed to prevent people from obstructing abortion facilities on the one hand, and also designed to prevent people from storming churches, essentially, and taking them over in the middle of services. According to NPR, a prominent civil rights attorney and at least 2 other people involved in an anti-immigration enforcement protest disrupting a service at a Minnesota church have now been arrested, according to Trump administration officials on Thursday. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced the arrest of Nikema Levy Armstrong in a post on X. Again, all of that follows protesters entering the city's church in St. Paul, where a local official with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement serves as a pastor. And then Pam Bondi later posted on X a second person had been arrested, followed by a third arrest announced by FBI Director Kash Patel. Now, as always, social media tomfoolery makes these things more ridiculous. Apparently, the White House posted a digitally altered image of one of the people who was arrested. In the original picture, she looks composed. In the White House image, she is apparently dramatically crying. Which is like, why? Like, why? Who is doing this stupidity? And it's enough for the legacy media to make things up. You don't need people in the social media sphere for the White House making things up and making the job of the legacy media really a lot easier. That's really foolish. We'll get to what the church had to say, what its attorneys had to say about all this in a moment. First, from Amazon MGM Studios comes Melania. Every protocol, every precaution, every move coordinated. This new film takes you inside the 20 days leading up to the 2025 presidential inauguration through the eyes of the First Lady herself. The briefings, the planning, the private conversations. Witness what it takes to secure her return to one of the most powerful roles in the world. Melania is only in theaters January 30th. It is well worth the watch. Make sure that you go check it out. Again, Melania heads to theaters January 30th. Also, as we move into 2026, many businesses, including the Daily Wire, are ramping up hiring efforts to meet ambitious new objectives. But bringing those goals to life requires assembling the right team, and that's easier said than done. Today's hiring landscape presents unique obstacles, from sourcing candidates with niche expertise to sifting through overwhelming numbers of applications and finding the truly qualified prospects. For companies facing those hurdles, our sponsor, ZipRecruiter, offers a solution designed to streamline the entire hiring process. Right now, you can explore what ZipRecruiter has to offer at no cost by visiting ZipRecruiter.com/dailywire. ZipRecruiter's matching technology really cuts through the typical hiring headaches. As soon as you post a role, you can see exactly how many qualified candidates are in your area. No guessing, no waiting around. Their resume database lets you go straight to top candidates and access their contact info immediately. That saves both time and money. It's no surprise they're the #1 rated hiring site on G2. When you're running a company, you need tools that actually deliver results, and that's what ZipRecruiter does. Let ZipRecruiter help you find the best people for all your roles. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within day 1. See for yourself. Just go to this exclusive web address right now to try ZipRecruiter for free. That's ZipRecruiter.com/dailywire. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/dailywire. Now, attorneys representing City's church in St. Paul, which is, of course, the church that was victimized in this situation, they put forward a statement from Renee Carlson, the general counsel. Quote, "The First Amendment does not allow premeditated plots or coordinated actions to violate the sanctity of a sanctuary, disrupt worship, and intimidate small children. There's no trespass to invade a sanctuary or to conspire to interrupt religious services. The Constitution protects citizens from threats against fundamental rights by the government, but it also requires government to protect those same rights when they are jeopardized by private actors." And the director of litigation for True North Legal, a person named Doug Wardlaw, put out a statement very similarly, saying, "The U.S. Department of Justice acted decisively by arresting those who coordinated and carried out this terrible crime, which is to invade a church and terrorize worshipers." That is his quote. "The arrests and the prosecutions to follow will help ensure mob aggression, like City's church experienced, will not be repeated in any other house of worship." That is a good move by the Trump administration. Now, it doesn't mean that the people arrested aren't going to fib about it. One of the people arrested, as mentioned, was Nikema Levy-Armstrong, a civil rights attorney. And here she was on CNN claiming that she was welcomed into the church. Well, I mean, under false auspices, as she then proceeds to explain.
"We did not rush into that church. We actually went and sat down and participated in the service. And after the pastor prayed, that is when I stood up and asked him a question in response to his prayer. And then he responded to me. And then I proceeded to ask him about Pastor David Easterwood and how is it possible for him to serve as both the pastor and the director of ICE for Minnesota. And instead of responding to me, as soon as I said the name David Easterwood, the pastor said, 'Shame, shame.' And that is when I led us in chants, 'Justice for Renee Good' and 'Hands up, don't shoot.'"
Okay, so that, of course, is ridiculous. You don't get to go into somebody else's church, and then if you wait for 5 minutes and then break out into a disruption of the church service, call that permission to enter the church. That is not right. If you go into somebody's house claiming that you are, for example, a carpet salesperson and you want to check out the house, and the person invites you in, you proceed to steal all the crockery. Well, it turns out they didn't invite you in the house to steal the crockery. That is a ridiculous argument, and that one is not going to hold up in court. Now, one of the people that the DOJ wanted to charge was Don Lemon, the former CNN talking head and host. So Don Lemon, and again, I know Don. Don is a character, to say the very least. Well, Don had pretty clearly, allegedly coordinated with this group to be there. How else would he know to be there? He wasn't just attending a random church in St. Paul on that day. That is not what was happening. Well, he showed up, and a judge in Minnesota was handed an indictment for him and rejected the indictment. That judge rejected the federal prosecutor's attempt to criminally charge Don Lemon in relation to his presence this week during a protest at that St. Paul church. According to the Washington Post, this represents an extraordinary rebuke of a Justice Department that has drawn criticism for its forceful response to demonstrations against ICE officers. The magistrate judge's decision was described Thursday by two people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity. Their accounts emerged the same day department officials announced the arrests of, again, the other three. Well, it turns out, shock of shocks, it turns out that the judge in this particular case, according to Bill Malugin of Fox News, actually, his wife works as an assistant attorney general in Minnesota under Keith Ellison. So Keith Ellison is the attorney general of the state, and he, of course, is an ally of Don Lemon. In fact, here he was over the course of the last 24 hours, joining Don Lemon's show to explain why Don Lemon didn't do anything wrong.
Look, it's a wild stretch and inappropriate. And the FACE Act, by the way, is designed to protect the rights of people seeking their reproductive rights to be protected, and so that people, for a religious reason, cannot just use religion to break into women's reproductive health centers, right? So how they are stretching either of these laws to apply to people who protested in a church over the behavior or the perceived behavior of a religious leader is beyond me. But they don't mind stretching these days.
Okay, well, it's not actually a stretch. Now, Keith Ellison is out there telling Don Lemon, quote, "People have a right to lift up their voices and make their peace, and none of us are immune from the voice of the public." And then he said, "Chanting cannot be a crime. It's freedom of expression." Well, actually, not so much. not so much. It turns out that the FACE Act explicitly talks about the attempts to disrupt church services. It explicitly protects religious freedom. It imposes criminal penalties on anyone who, quote, by force or threat of force or by physical obstruction intentionally injures, intimidates, or interferes with, or attempts to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise the First Amendment right of religious worship at a place of religious worship. That is what it is. That's legitimately what the law was designed to do. Why? Well, because it was essentially a trade. This was a bipartisan bill signed into law in 1994. On the one hand, Democrats were saying that they wanted to protect abortion clinics from people who are obstructing the entrances. And Republicans said, we're not going to vote for that unless you also vote that you're not allowed to disrupt church services. So yes, part of the FACE Act is preventing this sort of stuff pretty clearly. But that's what Keith Ellison is all about. Again, it is not about the impartial administration of law. And so there's something a little bit problematic about the fact that the wife of the judge who's protecting Don Lemon works for Keith Ellison. Representative Tom Emmer, he says Keith Ellison needs a refresher course in law. This is true.
But there's another thing he said, which is this behavior did not violate the First Amendment. This is what they do. They just go to talking points. Keith Ellison is a lawyer. He's our attorney general. He's an embarrassment. He would prefer to prosecute cops and defend criminals rather than doing his job. And by the way, when you suggest that interrupting a faith community while they're worshiping is a exercise of your First Amendment rights, I would suggest he head back for a refresher course in law school, because he clearly didn't learn the law, because he certainly doesn't understand.
Well, that, of course, is Tom Emmer, Republican of Minnesota, and he is right about all of that. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, also came out and suggested that it was absolutely terrible, awful, in fact, for the Trump DOJ to indict people who are disrupting church services and entering churches without permission in order to do that. Jacob Frey tweeted, quote, "This is a gross abuse of power. The federal government is picking and choosing who to investigate, going after protesters, and not the person who shot and killed one of our neighbors. I'm calling for Nikema to be released immediately." Well, I mean, good for him. And I declare bankruptcy like Michael Scott. You know, that and $5 will buy you a pretty mediocre cup of coffee. But it is always incredible to see who the Minneapolis mayor will bow before and who he will instead allow to trample all over the law, including, of course, people who are attempting to violate the rights of others to worship freely in a church. Now, the question is how all of this is going to impact the 2026 midterm elections. And that is not the biggest question. The biggest question, of course, is whether we continue to enforce the law. But this will be a major issue in the run-up to the 2026 elections. And there are a couple of ways this could go. On the one hand, Democrats have an inherent advantage. On the generic ballot, it is an off-year election. Off-year elections typically move in favor of the party out of power. Nate Silver suggests that Democrats have some pretty good news here. The pretty good news for Democrats is that in the generic ballot, they are on average up by more than 5 points at this point in time. Not only that, it means that because there's a margin of error, it is possible that anything from an 11-point Democratic win to a 0.4-point Republican edge could be within that margin of error. Well, that spells potential blowout for the Democrats, and even if Republicans were to win slightly in the national popular vote, that would be a disappointment for Democrats, but they might still win back the House. So Democrats certainly have some pretty significant advantages. Does that mean that Democrats are definitely going to win? Well, they're acting like it, aren't they? Democrats are acting as though it is inevitable that they are going to win the 2026 elections. That is the only rationale that I can use to explain why they continue to embrace the most radical policies that Americans really are not going to like. So, for example, Eric Swalwell, one of my congressional bête noirs who is now running for governor of California, he says that he will make ICE agents unhireable in California. So if you were working for ICE, he's going to say that you will never be able to work in California again. Why is this sort of thing going to benefit Democrats generically across the country?
As governor, I'll use my emergency powers and I'll tell every state agency we are not, as a policy, hiring ICE agents. Because right now, these guys doing this work, it's a decision. No one's holding a gun and saying you have to work for ICE. And so when I'm governor, if you're still working for ICE and you haven't got the message that no one's asking you to do this, you won't be hired in the state. And it's part of an approach that says either we can be on our heels as the most vulnerable in our community, or we can make them react and go on offense. And so I can't take on any other crisis until I do that first part of the job, which is, to be a fighter protector for Californians.
So again, what you have right now is a bit of a game of hold my beer when it comes to immigration. On the one hand, you have an administration that for the most part is attempting to go after criminal illegal immigrants, but doing a terrible job rhetorically in doing so. Truly not doing a very good job rhetorically in explaining that they are going after criminal illegal immigrants. They've been trying a little bit harder in the last couple of weeks, but the reality is the polling shows that Americans do not approve of what they perceive ICE to be doing. As Karl Rove points out over at the Wall Street Journal, in a January 12th Quinnipiac University poll, 57% of all voters and 64% of independents disapprove of how ICE is enforcing immigration law. Now, again, what they think of what ICE is doing is not actually what ICE is doing. Many of them think that ICE is simply going and rounding people up generally at Home Depot. That is not what ICE is doing. They are, in fact, targeting criminal operations in which illegal immigrants are involved. Sure, when you're attempting to deport some 660,000 people, which I believe is the number that they've worked on deporting thus far, when you do that, you're going to catch up some people who may not have committed an extraneous crime. But ICE has been directing its resources at the worst offenders, no question. Well, the administration needs to do a better job of explaining that. Democrats, on the other hand, can't restrict themselves to saying that the Republicans should stick to criminal illegal immigrants. Instead, they go all the way with Eric Swalwell and talk about how they're going to make it so that ICE agents are unhirable. They go with Zoran Mamdani, who says he's going to attempt to defund ICE if he ever gets the opportunity. It is amazing how everybody misreads the tea leaves. Everyone misreads what the American people want. They believe always that the American people want what they are selling, but the most extreme version of it, and that is almost never true. That is almost never, ever true. That is why I cannot explain to you why exactly Virginia Democrats have decided to swing all the way to the left. So Abigail Spanberger won the governorship of Virginia. She was purporting to be a sort of blue dog, moderate Democrat. She, of course, had chewed out some of the more extreme versions of the Democratic Party. She had chewed out AOC. She had chewed out Ilhan Omar. She had suggested that their defund the police routine was bad politics. Well, now Virginia Democrats are shifting to far-left policies. As Virginia Kruta points out at the Daily Wire, at the top of their agenda seems to be implementing some kind of wealth tax in Virginia. Lawmakers have already introduced several competing bills that would create new tax brackets with steeper rates for higher earners. One bill would nearly double the state income tax rate for Virginians who make over $1 million a year. Not only that, they've also decided that they're going to make it easier to pursue voter fraud, and they're teeing up bills to make the state softer on crime and illegal immigration. One bill would eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for certain offenses, including but not limited to illegal sales of cigarettes and alcohol, certain conduct punishable as involuntary manslaughter, and violations of certain provisions of protective orders. Another couple of bills pushed by Virginia Democrats would help protect illegal immigrants in Virginia. One, by barring officials from arresting illegal immigrants in courthouses, and another, by fining employers who pay illegal aliens less than the established minimum wage. Why each party seems to feel the necessity to swivel all the way out to the left is absolutely beyond me. It makes no sense at all, and it is bad electoral politics, just bad. Now, Gavin Newsom, what he's doing, again, I think that Gavin Newsom is not the world's best candidate. I will say that what Gavin Newsom seems to be attempting to do is fib about his pretty radical record in California while focusing in on Trump. That is the happy medium that he is pursuing. Again, he was over in Davos, and he suggests that what he is going to do is basically just attack Trump, but he's going to be moderate on policy, which and is a better pitch than many of the other Democrats who seem to be swiveling way out on policy. Now, the thing about Newsom is, if you look at his policy in California, it's pretty dang radical. We talked about that on his podcast. But it is fascinating to watch him play maybe the only smart hand in the Democratic Party right now.
So I put a mirror up to Trump and Trumpism in all caps. And it was ironic because Pravda, Fox News in America, others, they got offended by it. They said, well, where's his mother to wash his mouth out with soap? I said, well, where the hell have you been? You've never said a word about Trump dressing up as the Pope, tweeting out and cosplaying on the world stage. And so the Treasury Secretary talked about a Barbie doll. It was as if he was reading a diary and had just broken up with someone. I mean, that was the Secretary of Treasury using valuable time yesterday on the world stage. Thank you for not sharing that on the official White House account. We're deeply in their head. I think the affordability agenda appears to be, I'm living rent-free in the Trump administration's head.
Okay, so again, what he is doing is he is focusing all of his ire on Trump personally. And he's talking about how he lives free in Trump's head. And he talks about knee pads for Trump and all this kind of stuff because he doesn't want to talk policy. Because the minute the Democrats are forced to talk policy, they've got a problem. They have to lie and campaign as moderate Republicans, or they have to go fully radical in order to entice their base. It'll be fascinating to see what they do. Now, again, does that mean that Republicans are going to fare better? I mean, not necessarily. They can also do a bunch of stupid things. I think, frankly, they do many stupid things by promoting the worst aspects of what seem to me very often eminently reasonable policies. But there are some factors that are moving in a Republican direction if they can actually tout them properly. So, for example, the New York Times Siena poll, the latest poll, shows that actually people are feeling better about the economy. If you take a look at people who believe that the economy is excellent or good versus the people who believe the economy is poor, right now about 29% of Americans believe the economy is excellent or good. About 38% believe that the economy is poor. That sounds bad until you realize that that is, in fact, the best number in over 4 years. That you have to go back before 2022 to get to a number even remotely like that. You have to go back all the way to 2019 probably to get a number that is better than that. So people are, in fact, feeling better about the economy. And that may redound to President Trump's benefit. That at least is going to be the hope. And the hope should be that the administration's border policy starts to pay dividends, that people calm down about ICE, or that the Democrats continue to go out on a limb over ICE, and that there are some foreign policy wins that materialize sometime between now and the election. Now, speaking of foreign policy, there may be some major changes with regard to geopolitics over the course of the next few months. Begin in Cuba. According to the Wall Street Journal, emboldened by the U.S. ouster of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, the Trump administration is apparently searching for Cuban government insiders who can help cut a deal to push out the communist regime by the end of the year, according to people familiar with the matter, which of course would be an astonishing event. If the communist regime in Cuba actually fell, that would be a game changer for a lot of Cuban Americans. It would be a game changer for the hemisphere. In the same way that it would be a game changer if the Maduro ouster resulted in Venezuela eventually democratizing and becoming a non-enemy of the United States. Again, we're already earning some geopolitical dividends by cutting China off from Venezuelan oil, for example. If Cuba were to turn into a friendly, that would change the hemispheric gravity in a pretty significant way. And President Trump has been pushing Cuba pretty hard. He stated in a January 11th social media post, quote, "I strongly suggest they make a deal before it's too late. No more oil or money." They've assessed that Cuba's economy is close to collapse and that the government has never been this fragile after losing their biggest benefactor in Nicolas Maduro. Officials don't have a concrete plan to end the communist government that has held power on the Caribbean island for almost 7 decades, but they see what happened to Maduro as a blueprint and a warning for Cuba. So, again, what they're looking for here is a palace coup. They are not looking for some sort of full-scale Bay of Pigs style invasion. Now, leave aside the history of the Bay of Pigs and whether or not the JFK administration did a terrible job with it. The reality is that the American people are not up again for a gigantic invading force in Cuba fighting on the hills. But if there is somebody who is friendlier in the government willing to topple the current regime, that would change things pretty significantly. Cuba has basically been cut off from all the money. The administration is also taking aim at Cuba's overseas medical missions. That is Havana's most important source of hard currency, including through visa bans targeting Cuban and foreign officials accused of facilitating the program. So were Cuba to fall, that would be a big win, obviously, for the president of the United States. The other big win that may be on the agenda is the situation in Iran. So reports suggest that the United States has deployed significant resources in the Persian Gulf toward Iran. According to Reuters, President Trump said on Thursday the U.S. has an armada heading toward Iran. Here was the president on Air Force One.
We have a big force going toward Iran. I'd rather not see anything happen, but we're watching them very closely. I saw 837 hangings on Thursday. They would have been dead. Every one of them would have been hung. This is like from 1,000 years ago. This is an ancient culture. Very smart people, by the way. It's an ancient culture. 837, mostly young men, were going to be hung on Thursday. And I said, if you hang those people, you're going to be hit harder than you've ever been hit. It'll make what we did to your Iran nuclear look like peanuts. And an hour before this horrible thing was going to take place, they canceled it. And they actually said they canceled it. They didn't postpone it. They canceled it. So that was a good sign. But we have an armada. We have a massive fleet heading in that direction. And maybe we won't have to use it. We'll see.
Now, again, we will have to see what this means, because just because the Iranian government said that they didn't hang a bunch of people doesn't mean they didn't murder those people, or that they haven't kept those people under arrest until the moment when murder becomes more possible for them. On Tuesday, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which had been in the South China Seas, was, in fact, making its way to the region according to ship tracking data. That aircraft carrier and 3 accompanying destroyers were all confirmed to be heading west toward the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, the USS George H.W. Bush is at sea in the Atlantic Ocean bound for Europe. That aircraft carrier is conducting live fire exercises and other training activities, as per a post on the ship's official Facebook page. So, we'll see if the president actually activates here. Reports coming out of Iran seem to be getting worse and worse in terms of what the impact was, what the regime actually did. The numbers continue to go up and up and up in terms of the number of dead and the number of wounded in Iran. The president set a red line. The Iranians violated the red line. The president just set a red line, by the way. He said that people should go out in the streets and continue to protest. Help is on the way. That is a pretty strong red line, and Iran violated it. So does it require another trigger in order for the United States to do something? Again, doing useless things is not the goal here. Neither is a full-scale invasion of Iran. No one would like to see hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground in the Middle East for the 1,000th time. No one is interested in that. The question is, what is possible, what is doable, and what ensures that the United States is still feared on the world stage? Because you want to make sure that if you set a red line, you don't turn into Barack Obama. Okay. Meanwhile, on the foreign policy front, the Europeans seem to be in a better mood after they pushed the president, or at least dealt with the president to the point that he did not levy gigantic tariffs on the European Union. They're apparently now willing to admit some truths. The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he said at Davos that Europe does, in fact, have to revitalize its economy, that their forms and their regulations, their permitting processes have made the economy in Europe just weak.
Germany and Europe have wasted incredible potential for growth in recent years by dragging feet on reforms and unnecessarily and excessively curtailing entrepreneurial freedoms and personal responsibility. We are going to change that now. Security and predictability take precedence over excessive regulation and misplaced perfection. We must reduce bureaucracy substantially in Europe. The single market was once created to form the most competitive economic area in the world, but instead, we have become the world champion of over-regulation.
He is right about that, absolutely. He also added, this new world of great powers is being built on power, on strength, and when it comes to it, on force. It is not a cozy place. We do not have to accept this new reality as fate. We're not at the mercy of this new world order. We do have a choice. We can shape the future. To succeed, we must face harsh realities and chart our course with clear-eyed realism. Merz did suggest, however, that Europe should continue to pursue strong transatlantic ties with the United States. So he is operating in the world of reality. So he says that, yes, the EU may have prompted some movement from the Trump administration away from going after them over Greenland. That does not mean that Europe should abandon the United States or vice versa. So it seems that overall, the president may have achieved many of his goals in Europe, get them to deregulate, get them to be stronger on their borders, get them to spend more on their defense. And, as far as Greenland goes, I'm not really that concerned about small victories won in Greenland or pride out of the Europeans in Greenland nearly as much as I am about the Europeans taking seriously the threats that come from other places on the globe and the reality that we do need strong allies. And that means sometimes pushing our friends to do the right thing in order to strengthen their own economies and their own military. So that's on the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side of the ledger, the continued unwillingness of the Trump administration to face reality when it comes to Vladimir Putin seems short-sighted to me at the very least. Apparently, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner headed on over to Russia in order to greet Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin. So there they are. They're meeting. Steve Witkoff looks a lot warmer with Vladimir Putin than Jared Kushner does in that particular tape. According to Bloomberg, there was no immediate word on the outcome of the meeting, which ended well after midnight Moscow time. That was Witkoff's seventh visit to Putin. Now, again, Witkoff in the past has gone in there and used Putin's translator. So I've yet to see Witkoff's extraordinary negotiating legerdemain with regard to the Ukraine-Russia deal. U.S. and Ukrainian officials have said they've made significant progress on their 20-point plan, but Moscow has yet to actually acknowledge any of that as a positive. Meanwhile, the United States is apparently weighing a complete military withdrawal from Syria. Presumably, they are doing so because they now believe that the Syrian government is a friendly. It seems to me a little bit early to declare the Syrian government a friendly in this fashion, considering that they and the Turks are basically going around killing the Kurds and also going after religious minorities like the Druze in the south. The Turkish government is one of the more malign actors on the world stage right now, and pretending that they are an erstwhile American ally is foolhardy in the extreme. They are run by a radical Islamist, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has gotten rid of the secularist-leaning military apparatus. He has spent a quarter century doing that, and he has converted it into an Islamist-leaning governance structure that is friendly with a wide variety of terrorist groups around the Middle East. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal, Washington is considering a complete withdrawal of American troops from Syria as Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa moved to wrest control of the northeastern part of the country from an American-backed Kurdish-led militia. So, yet another presumed ally that the Americans have abandoned over the course of the last 25 years or so would be the Kurds. I mean, at this point, the Kurds must be tired of American guarantees that end with Americans basically leaving them in harm's way. The move would end a decade-long American operation in Syria, which began in 2014 when Barack Obama intervened in the country's civil war, and it would come as Sharaa's government ordered the U.S. military's longtime partner in the region, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, to disband. The U.S. considered a drawdown in Syria before. Now, again, drawing down is not the worst idea in the world. It's just that if you believe that the Syrian government is a friend to the West, you've got another thing coming. Normalization with the Syrian government, while they go after America's ally in that region, in the Syrian Defense Forces, is pretty astonishing stuff. Roughly 1,000 American troops are in Syria, most scattered across facilities in the northeast where they are co-located with the SDF. Apparently, the Pentagon is questioning the viability of the American military's mission in Syria after the SDF's defeat. Much of the assault's success was the result of Arab tribal forces who were once loyal to SDF switching sides to back the government, presumably with the help of the Turkish military. Pretending that Turkey has nothing to do with this would be ignorant. The fact that we continue to talk about selling them F-35s and treating them as a NATO ally is sort of insane to me. Speaking of which, if we are talking about the insanity of welcoming aboard the sort of Western alliance, countries that ought not be part of it, there's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen in Gaza. The attempt to rope in Qatar and Turkey, or allow them in, is foolhardy in the extreme. These are both countries that have supported Hamas soup to nuts. This does not mean that what is being laid out by the United States in Gaza is totally impossible. It means the only way that what the United States is trying to do becomes possible is if you reckon with reality. Reality has a funny way of biting you directly in the ass if you ignore it. And pretending that without security arrangements, or if you have security arrangements including terror allies, that you're still going to be able to build a thriving society in the heart of the Gaza Strip, one of the most radicalized areas on planet Earth, that seems short-sighted at the very least. So, the United States has now listed its plans for the Gaza Strip. According to the New York Times, Jared Kushner laid out an ambitious and highly speculative vision for the future of the Gaza Strip in Davos. The presentation featured slides depicting gleaming skyscrapers rising on Gaza's coast and construction of entirely new cities. The plan would require investment of at least $25 billion in the Palestinian enclave. Gaza said Jared Kushner would be rebuilt in phases, starting with the south. The southern city of Rafah would be rebuilt in 2 to 3 years. That, of course, is the area that right now is essentially protected by the Israeli Defense Forces. Other areas, like Khan Yunis, are not at this point, which means that Hamas is likely going to infiltrate those areas. Hamas continues to hold arms, including small arms. Jared Kushner outlined the proposal during the gathering. Here was Jared Kushner spelling it out.
So we did a master plan. We brought in, I thank you, Yakir Gabay, who's one of the most successful real estate developers and brilliant people I know. He's volunteered to do this, not for profit, really because of his heart. He wants to do this. And we've developed ways to redevelop Gaza. Gaza, as President Trump's been saying, has amazing potential. And this is for the people of Gaza. We've developed it into zones. In the beginning, we were toying with the idea of saying, let's build a free zone, and then we have a Hamas zone. And then we said, you know what, let's just plan for catastrophic success. Hamas signed a deal to demilitarize. That is what we are going to enforce. People ask us what our plan B is. We do not have a plan B. We have a plan. We signed an agreement. We are all committed to making that agreement work. There's a master plan. We'll be doing it in phasing. In the Middle East, they build cities like this in 2-3 million people. They build this in 3 years. And so stuff like this is very doable if we make it happen.
Okay, now the question becomes, how do you disarm Hamas? That is always the question, always. So Jared Kushner said that there will be demilitarization within the first 100 days.
As we're creating this system, hopefully it's something that we can just document these learnings and make them available to all else who want to use them in the future. So demilitarization, this is something we're starting now that we have a new government in Gaza. This government will be working with Hamas on the demilitarization to really take the principles that were agreed to in the document to the next phase, and hopefully that will be successful. Without that, we can't rebuild. So if Hamas does not demilitarize, that will be what holds back Gaza and the people of Gaza from achieving their aspiration, and that's very important. So the next 100 days, we're going to continue to just be heads down and focused on making sure this is implemented. We continue to be focused on humanitarian aid, humanitarian shelter, but then creating the conditions to move forward.
Okay, well, again, that doesn't really answer what happens if Hamas refuses to disarm. That is the $100 billion question. What if Hamas simply refuses to disarm? What happens next? Who's the enforcement body? Is the enforcement body going to be Turkey and Qatar kind of testifying that they've disarmed? Will it be the IDF? Who is actually going to do the dirty work if Hamas refuses to disarm? That remains the big question here. Now, again, the plan itself is inspiring and good if it can be achieved, but it does require the demilitarization of Hamas, and it requires the denazification of Gaza, meaning that a huge percentage of the people in the Gaza Strip supported Hamas and continue ideologically to support Hamas. That means education programs that aren't run by Hamas. It means the UNRWA becoming a non-entity in the Gaza Strip. There are a lot of steps that have to be taken if this is going to materialize. If it does, that'd be great. But unless you can answer that question, how does Hamas get disarmed? I think that a lot of obstacles remain. Meanwhile, on the cultural front, one of the great moments in culture history happened over the course of the last few days. And I know we were remiss that we did not report on this, but you know who did? Was Lyndon Blake, Daily Wire reporter extraordinaire and correspondent from Podcast Land, where apparently Michelle Obama appeared on the most important podcast of our time. It is basically Einstein for dummies. Call her daddy. So, Lyndon, tell me about this magical moment.
This is insane, Ben. I know you're not the call her daddy target audience, so I'm going to fill you in on what this podcast is really about. We had Michelle Obama on with Alex Cooper, and they spent the first half of the podcast talking about objectifying women and how it is so awful. Meanwhile, the podcast is called Call Her Daddy. That is a play tongue-in-cheek on a podcast that started out being a hypersexual podcast. The whole point was to teach girls how to entice men, how to get the guys to call them daddy and be controlling and manipulative. So it's very ironic. Anytime I hear Alex Cooper try to tell me about how women are objectified in this country, when I'm like, you made your career on telling girls how to act in the bedroom.
Now, we have seen other major political figures appear on Call Her Daddy. Most famous, Kamala Harris appeared on Call Her Daddy during her successful run for the presidency. Wait, it didn't work out. Amazing. So Michelle Obama shows up on this podcast, and how did it go? Did they have deep and important conversations about Michelle Obama's sex life or favorite positions or what? Because I know that sounds like a joke, but that's actually a thing that Alex Cooper does talk about on her show is stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, she introed this the same way she kind of did the Kamala interview. She's like, I've thought about, all the ways to do this interview, but I'm going to go with this. So she did the same thing with Michelle Obama. She opens the interview and she goes, I thought we could do this way and talk about your sex life and all of that. And Michelle was like, or lack thereof, and Alex goes, well, I was going to go this way and let's talk about being a woman and women empowerment. And then they just go on to just talk in circles about how women are treated so awful in this country and all men care about is the way women look and how they dress. And it's just not reality. But that's what we learn about those that lean left. They don't live in reality.
Well, one of the things that I find really hilarious about this is that apparently Michelle Obama went on there and complained about the patriarchy. And one of the things that came up was women taking men's names when they get married and how this is very terrible for them, which is funny because her name is Michelle Obama and no one would know who the hell she is if she were still Michelle Robinson.
Yeah, she acts like it's the hardest thing ever to have to teach herself how to write MRS period instead of MISS. Like, oh, the horror of changing your name, changing how you're addressed. That's just one other thing that women have to do that men don't. I thought that whole segment was silly. And then you have Alex trying to bring it back to her audience who are single women in the dating world. And she's like, Michelle, this is something that comes up with my audience members. They're women and they are successful, which I think I'm successful. I love success. But she's like, they're scared to date a guy because most men don't want that. They're going to be intimidated. And all I can think about in my head is I'm like, no, most men don't think that. In fact, only losers think that way. Like most men, I don't know about you, Ben, would enjoy some more golf trips if their wife was successful. I think they like it. I did this segment once on Broadway in Nashville where I asked women if they would date a guy that made less than them. 100% the answers were no. So what's that about?
Yes, I mean, it is sort of funny how much of this interview seemed to be projection. There's a lot of talk about how men just care all the time about what women wear, to which I thought to myself, I've been married for almost 20 years. I'm not sure I can name more than like 2 outfits my wife has ever worn in 20 years. Yeah. It is like men never think about what women are wearing. It's such absolute nonsense. But again, everything is the fault of the patriarchy, apparently.
Yeah, I asked my husband, I'm like, do you remember what my wedding dress looks like? He's like, it was white. And I was like, there you go, ladies. Like they don't think about that.
Well, it was good times over on Call Her Daddy as per our usual arrangement. And I appreciate that Lyndon Blake, Daily Wire reporter extraordinaire, suffered through that. Lyndon, thanks for your time. Thanks for sticking through all of that and reporting on it.
Yep. 2 hours I'll never get back.
And meanwhile, on the cultural front, we have the 2026 Oscar nominations. I'm going to hold off on some of the rankings of these movies. I haven't seen some of them. I do know that One Battle After Another, which has received 13 Oscar nominations, is an incredibly overrated film. You can go view my review of that film over on YouTube. I thought that the film is poorly written. I think that the film is not acted well. I think Sean Penn particularly overacts in that film. It is not a great Paul Thomas Anderson flick. It's obvious writing. It's stupid. It's a really off-putting movie for people who are not ardent leftists, frankly. Some of the other movies that have been granted large numbers of nods, Sinners was given the most Oscar nominations ever. Now, to be fair, it has more Oscar nominations than, say, All About Eve. To be fair, there are more Oscar categories now. So that's sort of like, Roger Maris hitting 61 home runs in more games than Babe Ruth was able to play. So I'm not sure that I follow that, but I haven't seen Sinners yet, so I'm going to hold off on commentary on Sinners. There's some other nominations that I think are well-deserved. Ethan Hawke was nominated for Best Lead Actor for his role in Blue Moon, in which he plays the lyricist Lorenz Hart. He's terrific in it. I loved parts of the movie, not the whole movie, but he's really, really good in that film. Wicked, for good, basically got shut out. That is not a gigantic shock, frankly, because as I mentioned on the show, the second act of Wicked is not as good as the first act of Wicked. And so it wasn't as though that was going to clean up at the Oscars. Also, Cynthia Erivo, who was sort of the standout in the first one, is less of a main character in this movie. The one who got snubbed is Ariana Grande, who is good in the movie. I don't think she's fabulous, but I think she's good in the movie. Some of the other Best Picture nominees include Hamnet, which is Chloe Zhao's movie about William Shakespeare and his son Hamnet, which was supposed to serve as the inspiration for Hamlet in the movie. Haven't seen that one yet, so I'll hold off on it. F1 was nominated for Best Picture, which again, F1 is fine. It's okay. It's a worse version of Top Gun Maverick and Ford versus Ferrari. It's like, all right. Didn't love it. Sentimental Value. Haven't seen that one yet. Frankenstein, which again, I thought was going to be great, and I was kind of underwhelmed by it. This is Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which is beautifully produced, but kind of shockingly flat in the way that it's presented. The Secret Agent, which is a foreign film. I haven't seen that one yet. Marty Supreme, which is supposed to be good. Train Dreams, which is mostly kind of like a Terrence Malick film, kind of. It's not. Terrence Malick didn't do it, but it was nominated for Best Picture. It's a movie about a man who suffers a family tragedy and then sort of travels around the country looking at pretty things. I thought it was overrated. Begonia, by maybe the most overrated director working today, or at least one of the 5 most overrated directors, Yorgos Lanthimos. Everything he does is obvious. Everything that he does is far left wing. Begonia is about a CEO, a pharmaceutical CEO, who is kidnapped by people who believe she's an alien. And spoiler alert, it goes exactly where you think it was going to go. One Battle After Another, which, as I say, was wildly overrated, and Sinners, which was nominated for 16 Academy Awards. So those are your Best Picture nominees. Kind of an underwhelming crew in a lot of ways. On the other hand, I'm not sure what I've seen this year that rises to that level. I'll give you better ratings once I've seen all of the movies. I try to make a habit of seeing movies before I actually rate them or talk about whether they're good or not. Alrighty, folks, coming up, we'll get to tennis players being asked about their politics. I'm not sure why that is happening, but it seems to be happening a lot. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member and use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us. Alrighty, folks, Gavin Newsom is back, and he says that he wants to see more trans kids. Is that good for his 2028 hopes? Plus, President Trump suffering some speed bumps on the economy, and the Indiana GOP rejecting his plan for congressional redistricting. First, in less than 2 weeks, on Christmas Day, episodes 1 and 2 of the Pendragon cycle Rise of the Merlin begins streaming for Daily Wire Plus All Access members. Here's the truth. No one else is bold enough to make this. Nobody was going to bring this legend to life with the scale and the conviction it deserves. It was too big. It was too demanding. It's too risky. Well, we built this company to do the stuff that no one else would. And we're doing the same with entertainment. It's the most audacious entertainment play in the history of independent conservative media. By far, no close competitors. Christmas Day, All Access members see episodes 1 and 2 before anyone else. January 22nd, the 7-part epic launches for all our members. The wait is almost over. And the moment Rise of the Merlin hits your screen, you're going to understand exactly why we went this big. So right now, Democrats are looking at 2028, and they see Republican vulnerability. What they see is a 2024 election that, while it was fairly solid as a win for Republicans in the Electoral College, was a pretty narrow win in the popular vote. And they think that perhaps they can reverse the tides, that perhaps they can take the White House in 2028 with somebody like Gavin Newsom. Well, what Democrats have been doing in order to shift away from their 2024 failing strategy is they've been taking the least popular parts of their agenda, and they have been moving those to the back burner. So, DEI, you're hearing all about equity in the run-up to the 2024 election. It was the centerpiece of the Joe Biden campaign in 2020. It was, again, the centerpiece of the Kamala Harris campaign, the late-breaking Kamala Harris campaign in 2024. You do not hear Democrats talking about equity each and every day the way that they were before. They instead are talking about, for example, affordability. The same thing is true with regard to radical trans issues. The politics on transgenderism are awful for Democrats. The vast majority of Americans believe that boys are boys and girls are girls, and boys cannot become girls, and attempts to brainwash children into the idea that they are, in fact, members of the opposite sex, or even could be members of the opposite sex, is perverse. That telling a young kid that you might have a girl brain and a boy body is not only Gnostic and scientifically nonsensical, it is very, very wrong to do that to children. And that was the general perception among Americans, and it drove huge numbers for President Trump. The single most effective ad of the 2024 campaign was on this issue from the Trump campaign. It suggested that Kamala was for they, them. President Trump is for you. And again, if you talked to people in minority communities that swiveled from Democrat to Republican, this was a major issue because the trans issue, while of course affecting a fairly small percentage of the population, went to root truths of our society. Can you trust people who just tell you such a basic lie that boys can be girls? And the answer is no. And so Democrats have decided that they were going to put that on the back burner. One of those Democrats was Gavin Newsom. So a few months ago, Gavin Newsom was doing a podcast with the late Charlie Kirk, in which Charlie was pressing Gavin Newsom on trans politics. And Newsom admitted that boys should not be playing in girls' sports. And he admitted that there was unfairness to all of that. Well, now Gavin Newsom, believing that he is the frontrunner for the 2028 Democratic nomination, is being asked questions by members of the Democratic base. And so he did a podcast with Ezra Klein of the New York Times in which he was asked about his take on trans politics. And now that Newsom believes that he has to win primaries in the Democratic Party, as he prepares for that 2028 run, he will be forced to answer questions about things like, where is he on transgenderism, particularly with regard to minors? So he ended up swiveling back into what is, in fact, a losing strategy for Democrats. Here was the California governor proclaiming that he wants to see more trans kids.
Contradictions, bring it on. Contradictions, but that I think I can explain, perhaps. Evolutions. We didn't get into trans sports. That's an issue no one wants to hear about because 80% of the people listening disagree with my position on this. But it comes from my heart, not just my head. It wasn't a political evolution.
Your position being that?
I don't think it's I want to see trans kids. I have a trans godson. There's no governor that's signed more pro-trans legislation than I have, and no one has been a stronger advocate for the LGBTQ community. But you have to accommodate the reality of those whose rights are being taken away as we advance the rights of the trans community in terms of the fairness of athletic competition. And I just think that's not a bigoted position. And it's an example of some of the things I've been saying about being judgmental, dismissing people, throwing that person out of the party. I mean, you want to talk cancel culture. I've lived it on that issue alone, despite a record of 30 years. And people are willing to say, I'm done. Friendships I lost on that position. And that position, by the way, came to me 2 years prior, where I had to try to accommodate for a trans athlete and another athlete that were in the state finals in track and field, and they both dropped out because we couldn't figure out a way to make it fair. And it was so unfair to both their families. Broke my heart.
Okay, so that is Gavin Newsom trying to have every side of every issue. But the key there is that he says he wants to see trans kids. Okay, the normie position is that there is no such thing as a trans kid. There are kids who may have gender dysphoria. That is a different thing. There is no such thing as a kid who is a boy in a girl's body or upon whom we should be performing hormonal therapies and surgeries that are utterly unscientific and permanently damaging to the human body. So when Gavin Newsom says, I want to see trans kids, there's no governor that's done more pro-trans legislation than I have when he says that sort of stuff. That creates a real awkwardness for the Democratic Party. Well, this broke into the open because this led off a debate with Elon Musk. All right, coming up, Elon Musk fires back at Gavin Newsom, and it turns into a real firefight. First, do you trust your internet service provider? You probably shouldn't. Depending on where you live, ISPs can log your activity for the government or even sell your browsing history to the highest bidder. The solution? Our sponsor, ExpressVPN. It's an app that reroutes your online traffic through encrypted servers, keeping it away from your ISP, data brokers, and other third parties. Of course, this only works if you trust your VPN provider. You're essentially transferring that trust from your ISP to them. So why do I trust ExpressVPN? Well, they received over 300 data requests from law enforcement and government entities in the past year alone, and not a single one resulted in customer data being exposed. You can read their transparency report on their website. It's actually fascinating. It's not that they refuse to comply with legal requests. They cooperate as much as they can, but you can't hand over what you don't have. And ExpressVPN doesn't even keep activity logs, thanks to their specially engineered server architecture that runs on volatile memory, meaning nothing ever gets saved to disk. It's privacy by design. So I'm on the road these days pretty much all the time, and that means that I'm constantly using ExpressVPN, whether I'm at an airport or a hotel. Anytime I'm on public Wi-Fi, hell, I use it at home just to be safe. Plus, it works seamlessly across all your devices, phones, laptops, tablets. It's genuinely easy to use. Tap one button, now you're connected. So if you want the VPN I trust to protect my own online privacy, get ExpressVPN. In fact, you can get 4 extra months of ExpressVPN with my special link. Head on over to expressvpn.com/Ben. That's expressvpn.com/Ben to get 4 extra months. Also, getting a big variety of whole food ingredients into my diet, it's really key, especially with the constant work travel. Our sponsor, Balance of Nature's Whole Health System, makes it simple. Their convenient blend of fruits and veggies and easy-to-take capsules is kosher and ensures I'm getting essential nutrients every day without the hassle of prep work or meal planning. It's an effortless way to support my wellness goals while managing that busy on-the-go lifestyle. Balance of Nature's whole health system supplements are incredibly versatile, easy to work into your daily routine. The fiber and spice supplement blends smoothly into your favorite drinks. It adds a warm aromatic depth from its spice blend. And if you prefer, you can even open up the fruits and veggies capsules and mix the powder directly into a smoothie or sprinkle it over your meals. What makes these supplements special is they're packed with 47 ingredients from 100% real whole fruits, vegetables, spices, fibers, everything from psyllium husk and flaxseed to cinnamon, turmeric, mango, pineapple, wild blueberry, shiitake mushroom, spinach, kale, cayenne pepper, and so much more. It's a simple way to give your body the nutrition it needs every single day. I take Balance of Nature with me on the road. It makes nutrition really easy for me. New and existing customers can get 50% off the whole health system for life with this limited time offer. Go to balanceofnature.com to claim the offer. Okay, Elon Musk commented on Gavin Newsom's post. And then Gavin Newsom's press office replied, "Correct. We're sorry your daughter hates you, Elon." Which, by the way, is insane. I mean, it's insane. To get personal on these sorts of issues is really, really bad. Like, truly bad. When I discuss these issues, I try not to get personal on these issues. The reason I try not to get personal on these issues is because once you're into the emotional valence of somebody's family, you have a problem. And I hate politics that eventually is just reduced to my feelings about members of my own family. I remember a few years ago, this is a story I really haven't frequently told. A few years ago, I spoke at University of British Columbia up in Canada, and it was about this issue. It was about the trans issue. And a person got up who identified as trans. It was a man who believed that he was a woman. And he got up and he started asking a question, and he started personalizing the question. He started saying, well, my family treats me as though I'm a girl. And I said, I would really appreciate if we could keep this on the level of the philosophical and the issue-based. Because your interpersonal relations, once we get into critiquing interpersonal relations, this is going to get very personal very quickly. And this person kept insisting, no, I know that I'm a woman because my family treats me as a woman. And I kept saying, please, I don't want to talk about how your family treats you because that's about your family. It's not about the broader issue, which is the question of public policy and how we ought to deal with these issues as a general society. And the person wouldn't stop. And so finally, I said, the reason that your family is saying to you that you are a woman and confirming you in your delusion is because they are afraid that you will do something bad to yourself, not because they actually believe that you are a woman. They do not believe that you are a girl. They know that you are not. They are trying to humor you because they're afraid of what will happen if they do not. And this person got extremely emotional and rushed out of the room. Now, obviously, that was sort of a perfect YouTube clip. The reason you've never seen that on YouTube is because I went to the organizers of the event. This is in front of 2,000 people. I went to the organizers of the event, and I asked them to remove that from the tape because I knew that this person was going to be damaged by that tape, that it was going to hurt this person. Not only that, I then found friends of the person and asked this person to come to breakfast the next morning to make sure this person was okay. Okay, because when you merge the personal and the political in this way, it gets really ugly really quickly. So Gavin Newsom's press office going after Elon Musk's child is truly ugly stuff, really, really ugly stuff. So Elon Musk then tweeted back, "I assume you're referring to my son Xavier, who has a tragic mental illness caused by the evil woke mind virus you push on vulnerable children. I love Xavier very much and hope he recovers. My daughters are Azure, Exa, she goes by Y, and Arcadia, and they do indeed love me very much." The fact that Newsom's office went that low is really quite disgusting. That's really quite terrible from Gavin Newsom. And it just goes to show the Democrats are going to run headlong into their own radicalism on this issue. Now, again, they might do what Abigail Spanberger did in Virginia. They might try to avoid the issue altogether. Gavin Newsom seems like he's trying to avoid the issue altogether. But if he is dragged back into discussing this issue, and if Democrats keep making this a moral litmus test as to whether boys can be girls, especially minors, then they're going to be in for a world of hurt. Instead, they would, of course, like to talk about the economy. They'd like to talk about their new issue of affordability because they sense vulnerability there. And this brings us to President Trump's ratings on the economy. So right now, President Trump's ratings on the economy are particularly weak. He's down to something like 31% approval rating when it comes to his economic ratings, which of course makes Democrats incredibly happy. And as we've been discussing all week long on this issue, it turns out that there is, in fact, a bifurcation between the performance of the stock market or the performance of the employment market, at least the data that we have, and Americans' feelings about that, much of which is indeed embedded because of inflation over the course of the last 5 years. When people say that they want inflation to go down, they don't mean that they want inflation at a 2% rate. They mean they want prices to actively go down. And that sort of gap between what they want and what can actually be achieved is a very, very real gap. Nonetheless, it is having consequences for President Trump. The pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson, friend of the show, she has a piece in the New York Times talking about President Trump's poor approval numbers. She says this: what's crucial to understand about Mr. Trump's poor approval numbers is that unlike during his last term in the White House, people now disapprove of him because of the economy, not in spite of it. President Trump got a small bump recently as he paid more attention to the economy, at least in one poll. His approval figure rose from 38% to 41% in a Reuters Ipsos survey out this week. But his overall rating remains low when it comes to the cost of living at 31%. He's now traveling the country on an affordability messaging tour and can't help but revert to his insistence on his success against the evidence. So, how ominous is this? Well, says Kristen Soltis Anderson, for one thing, we should view all of this in the context of the current political climate. Job approval has typically been a strong signal of the country's political mood, with poor approval numbers often resulting in bad election outcomes. But lower job approval numbers are arguably simply the norm these days. Presidents don't get much of a honeymoon. It's no longer commonplace for a president to begin with job approval around 70% and then end his term 30 or 40 points lower, as Jimmy Carter did today. Job approval percentages instead tend to remain in a narrow band, with partisans largely dug in and unwilling to move. Voters seem less eager to give a thumbs up to a president for whom they did not vote, almost regardless of the circumstances. So, a job approval of 42% might not seem like a 5-alarm fire to President Trump, but affordability is sliding away from President Trump. Only 15% of respondents said in a Fox News poll last month that they think that President Trump's economic policies have helped them personally. So, it'll be interesting to see what sort of consequences this has. President Trump yesterday acknowledged that his polling numbers were a bit of a problem. And he said, quote, I inherited a mess from the Biden administration, the worst inflation in history, the highest prices our country has ever seen. In other words, affordability just 13 months ago was a disaster for the American people, but now it's totally different. Prices are coming down fast. Energy, oil, and gasoline are hitting 5-year lows. The stock market today just hit an all-time high. Tariffs are bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars, and we are respected as a nation again. When will I get credit for having created, with no inflation, perhaps the greatest economy in the history of our country? When will people understand what is happening? When will polls reflect the greatness of America at this point in time and how bad it was just 1 year ago? Again, I think that there's truth to that. However, when the president goes out on the road and he talks about how you really don't need to buy toys for your kids because we need steel, Americans inherently hear a trade-off that they either don't want to make or feel they shouldn't have to make. Caroline Leavitt at the White House was asked about President Trump's comments on that matter yesterday.
Is it a good look for him to be telling parents, oh, you should only buy, $2 or $3 for your kids, when he's one of the wealthiest people in the country or in the government?
Do you think the people in that room in Pennsylvania who the president was speaking to don't know the president's a billionaire? I think that's a very well-established fact. And actually, I think it's one of the many reasons they reelected him back to this office, because he's a businessman who understands the economy and knows how to fix it. And he's doing it right now, just like he did in his first term.
So agree with many of the things that President Trump is doing on the economy. But when you tell the American people that the tariff regime, which does in fact in the short term increase prices while lowering economic activity, when you tell them that it's bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars, and then tell them also you're not going to be able to afford to buy your kid a second doll for Christmas, that is not going to be a popular economic pitch. I don't care who says it, Republican or Democrat. And if President Trump is relying on another lowering of the interest rates in order to inject more liquidity into what is already a hot economy, he is right, it's a hot economy. We're running at 3% inflation or so. We have a 4.4% unemployment rate, and the stock market, the Dow Jones, is going to break 50,000 under his administration. That is a hot economy. We don't actually need more liquidity. We need fewer regulations and fewer barriers to entry. The focus on the central bank seems to me a mistake. Here's Caroline Leavitt on the interest rates.
I think the president has been quite clear about what he believes the Fed should be doing, which is lowering interest rates. I know there was a 1/4 point reduction this past week, and the president was pleased to see that, but he thinks more should be done.
Okay, so, again, I disagree. I think that the interest rates are probably where they need to be, and we need to let the economy settle just a little bit. Some predictability would be good at this point. However, the president's not great approval ratings on the economy. Democrats are seeing an opening here, and they are pile driving him with regard to, again, the term that they use, affordability. The nice thing about it is it's totally fungible, as we've discussed. If you said inflation, then you'd have a statistical metric by which to measure success. When you say affordability, that's a feeling. And sometimes I feel things are affordable. Sometimes I feel they aren't. Very rarely do I feel things are affordable. Very few people tend to feel that things are generally affordable. That is particularly true when Democrats stack the deck, as they have, with regard to Obamacare and health insurance subsidies. If you owe the IRS more than $5,000 in back taxes, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Priority Tax Relief. Look, I get it. Dealing with tax debt is stressful. Maybe you fell behind on filing, had to pull from your 401k, or you just hit a rough patch. Whatever has happened, Priority Tax Relief can help. They're a team of experienced tax attorneys, CPAs, and enrolled agents who've been doing this for over 15 years. These folks negotiate directly with the IRS on your behalf, and they're good at it. They've handled thousands of cases and helped clients reduce their tax debt significantly. Some people who owed $25,000 or even $50,000 were able to get that reduced to a fraction of the amount. They completely understand how overwhelming the situation can be. Their team walks you right through the process step by step, so you're never in the dark about what's happening. And they move fast to stop or prevent things like liens, wage garnishments, and those penalties that just keep piling up. The IRS has stepped up their collection efforts lately, but Priority Tax Relief can step in before things escalate. They're offering a free consultation, no upfront fees, no obligation. Just go to PriorityTaxRelief.com/Ben. That's PriorityTaxRelief.com/Ben. See how they can help you get this resolved. Also, Grand Canyon University, our sponsor. It's an affordable, private Christian university based in beautiful Phoenix, Arizona. It's one of the largest universities in the country. Praised for its culture of community and impact, GCU integrates the free market system, a welcoming Christian worldview, and free and open discourse into 369 academic programs with over 300 online. Join a nationwide community of learners redefining online education through GCU's 100% online MBA degree program. Learn ethical entrepreneurship and scale your business to serve your community. In addition to federal grants and aid, GCU's online students receive nearly $161 million in institutional scholarships in 2024. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University, private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu/myoffer to see the scholarships you may qualify for. Again, so many universities right now are bilking people. They're just taking them for a ride. They are teaching kids terrible values. That is not the case at Grand Canyon University. Go get a great degree at Grand Canyon University, private, Christian, and affordable. Visit gcu.edu/myoffer and see the scholarships you might qualify for. So Democrats have come up with a winning strategy with regard to Obamacare. Create a program that is bound to fail, and then when it fails, claim that Republicans are standing in the way of fixing it if they don't pour hundreds of billions of dollars into it. That is, in fact, the plan. By the way, the end point of that is what it always was, which is universal health care. That if it continues to fail and continues to fail and continues to fail, then you take the vast majority of Americans who are not on public health insurance, who in fact have private insurance plans, and then you say the only way to fix the system is for the government to take it over wholesale. At least Senator Patty Murray of Washington, Democrat, she at least is honest enough to admit this. Here she was on the floor of the Senate yesterday saying that actually, no matter what we do with Obamacare, we need universal health care.
We still need universal health care in America. We have needed it for a very long time. It is what I've always been fighting for. And whatever happens in the next few days, I'm going to keep pushing for reforms that make high-quality health care that's actually affordable a reality for every American.
Okay, so again, this is what Democrats actually want. But in order to get there, they need a program that eventually becomes non-feasible and requires gigantic infusions. They created Obamacare, and then they created gigantic subsidies, and then they had those subsidies set to expire. And then when they expire, they blame the Republicans for it. That is the plan. It is a politically useful plan for them, for sure. Right now, there's a stalemate in the Senate where Democrats refuse to go along with the Republican plan, Republicans refuse to go along with the Democratic plan. According to the Wall Street Journal yesterday, a Democratic effort to extend expiring healthcare subsidies drew some Republican votes, but failed on Thursday to advance in the Senate. Meanwhile, a GOP approach also failed, leaving no clear path in Congress for aiding millions of Americans facing soaring Affordable Care Act insurance costs next year. The Democratic proposal would have extended the enhanced COVID-era ACA subsidies for 3 years. That bill was backed by 51 senators, including several Republicans, Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Josh Hawley of Missouri, with 48 opposed. So a majority do support the extension of the healthcare subsidies, but that's short of the 60 votes needed to advance under the Senate's filibuster rules. Republicans then put forward an alternative healthcare bill that would not extend the subsidies, but would instead offer federal funds to some households to put toward out-of-pocket insurance costs. The Republican proposal failed, with 51 in favor and 48 opposed. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky sided with Democrats in voting against the measure because, again, Senator Paul doesn't like any government spending. The lack of progress means that open enrollment closes December 15th for plans starting on January 1st. And so households are now being forced to sign up for coverage with sharply higher costs with no guarantee that Congress will act to restore subsidies and bring the price tag down. This, of course, is what Democrats want. Senate Majority Leader John Thune criticized the Democratic bill as a continuation of the status quo and an attempt to disguise the real impact of Obamacare's spiraling healthcare costs. Thune said that after the vote, some Republicans want to talk with the Democrats, but we'll see if they have an audience. Josh Hawley said that he voted to advance both of them because he said, listen, anything that will bring down the cost is something that we should do, just electorally speaking. He said, I want to see big changes to both of them, but my view is we've got to do something. According to the White House, the president is working with his own health policy team as well as Republicans on Capitol Hill to find a solution. Here was the White House press secretary explaining it yesterday.
He has made unprecedented progress towards lowering healthcare costs in this country and drug prices. He's secured numerous most favored nation drug price deals with many more to come. As you know, the One Big Beautiful Bill, the working family tax cut, significantly expanded access to health savings accounts for those on Obamacare. Again, a Democrat written program and approved program, which has led to higher healthcare costs in this country. So it goes back to the issue of affordability. Democrats are now pretending they want a solution to this issue, but they created the problem. The president and Republicans are currently coming up with creative solutions and ideas to lower healthcare costs for the American people.
Okay, so, yeah, again, she's not wrong about this, but if people don't feel the healthcare costs lowering, it's not really going to matter very much. ABC's Mary Bruce pushed Caroline Leavitt about all this, and this is a clever trap for Democrats, and it's why the Republican position initially with regard to all of these things is that you have to replace them. You have to. You have to bite the bullet and you have to replace them. You can't just wait for Democrats to put you in the political vice that is expiring subsidies and then blaming it on you.
The president is prepared to take action on health care, and he wants Republicans on the Hill to do the same. As you have seen, Senate Republicans put forth their own legislation earlier this week. As for the subsidies that are set to expire, I would like to remind you and everybody at home why this is on the brink of happening. Democrats wrote Obamacare. They passed it without a single Republican vote, and then they ballooned it with these expensive COVID subsidies that completely distorted the health insurance market. And then they doubled down, extending those subsidies and setting their own expiration date right now in 2025, which the administration is obviously well aware of, and we are working. The president is working with his healthcare policy team here at the White House, as well as Republicans on Capitol Hill, to find a solution.
Again, the reality here is that Republicans should come up with a plan just on a practical political level that extends some of the subsidies for a year or at most 2 years, and then has a transitional plan away from the subsidies. That includes more deregulation and more health insurance options. That can include health savings accounts. Doesn't have to be limited to health savings accounts. There are many things that Avik Roy, for example, has discussed as a possibility in terms of lowering health insurance costs. You need more competition. You need more catastrophic healthcare plans that are available. In many areas, there's only one plan available, and it's just through Obamacare, because Obamacare made it very, very difficult to be essentially accredited to be part of Obamacare in the first place. Democrats, of course, are enjoying this. They create the crisis, and now they're doing the meme. They're doing the meme where the guy shoots the guy on the couch and then says, who would have done this? Democrats created the problem, but apparently it's the Republicans' fault. Here's Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader.
Republicans just blocked the Democrats' bill for a clean, simple extension of the ACA tax credits. The last chance they had to ensure people's premiums do not skyrocket in the coming months. Democrats did the work, but now Republicans chose the consequences. Now Republicans have all but guaranteed that tens of millions of people will see their premiums double or triple or more next year. Republicans now own America's health care crisis.
And not only that, according to Senator John Ossoff in Georgia, he says that senators will now decide if people live or die. By the way, this sort of language is not useful. Bernie Sanders has been doing it for years. The idea is that if you don't want his specific solution to American healthcare, that thousands will die. Whenever you suggest that the political policies pursued by your opposition on matters of economics are death issues, like life and death issues, you're raising the stakes pretty dramatically. And again, in an era where we talk about raising that temperature and the possibility of political violence, I just don't think this is useful or good.
This is life or death. People will die. This is one of the most consequential votes this Senate will take all year. By saying yay or nay to the clerk of the Senate later today, senators will decide whether people live or people die. Senators will decide whether Georgians and folks across the country are financially ruined or have a shot. 500,000 Georgians, it's projected, will lose their coverage altogether.
Now, again, this is an issue that Ossoff is speaking up about because he sees political advantage. He is up for re-election in 2026 in Georgia, which is indeed a red state. There are 2 Georgia Republicans who are seeking to run against him. One of them is U.S. Representative Mike Collins. The other is a former football coach named Derek Dooley. So it'll be interesting to see what the polling looks like for Ossoff. That is the reason why he is jumping on this issue. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he says that the reason that they are not supporting some sort of just increased subsidy is because the goal isn't to help out the 7% of Americans who are reliant on the subsidies. It's to reduce healthcare costs across the board.
We're working on a package of legislation that will reduce premiums for all Americans, not just 7% of them. And I've been talking to every one of these colleagues in the tough districts about that. So stay tuned. There's more to come.
Okay, but one of the hard realities of a legislature that is national in scope is that there are a lot of Republicans in purple districts who are going to have to go back and answer to their constituents and might lose their seats. And the same thing is true in the Senate. And we are seeing this across the country. Presidents in their second term rarely have coattails for the rest of their party. And so this is why one of the big controversies that emerged over the course of the last week was the question of redistricting, congressional redistricting in Indiana. Already coming up, the Indiana GOP bucks President Trump. What's going on there first? This episode is sponsored by Cars for Kids. Okay, folks, quick holiday reality check. Your prep list is long, the calendar is short, the guests are basically en route. Maybe you've got something else sitting out there you keep ignoring, a car, a boat, maybe an old vehicle just hogging that driveway. It's not helping you, it's just taking up space and losing value. Donate it to Cars for Kids. Cars for Kids makes it super easy. You go online, they schedule a free pickup at your convenience. They'll tow away any old vehicle you've got sitting around. Cars for Kids takes care of all the paperwork and the logistics. You walk away with a tax-deductible receipt, a vacation voucher, and space in your driveway for your guests. So act right now. Call 1-877-CARS-FOR-KIDS or donate online at carsforkids.org/Ben. That's carsforkids.org/Ben. Cars with a K. And yes, you should hurry because time is running out for that 2025 tax deduction. You know their jingle. You've heard about them for years. Right now, if you got that vehicle sitting out there doing nothing for you, why not donate it? You can help some kids. You can also get a tax deduction. It's a great deal for everybody all around. 1-877-CARS-FOR-KIDS or donate online at carsforkids.org/Ben. That's carsforkids.org/Ben. Cars with a K. So in Indiana, there is in fact a Republican state legislature. Nonetheless, Indiana rejected a plan to congressionally redistrict. Right now, there are 7 congressional districts in Indiana that are Republican and 2 that are Democrat. President Trump wanted Indiana's state legislature to redistrict, thus creating 9 seats for Republicans as opposed to 7. Nonetheless, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Indiana Senate rejected a congressional redistricting plan in a rebuke to President Trump, who had a pressure campaign put on Republican lawmakers. The state Senate denied the new map by a vote of 31-19. 21 senators from the Republican majority and all 10 Senate Democrats voted down the proposal. Texas, of course, is going along with President Trump. But Republican State Senator Greg Good, who voted against the new map, said, "Friends, we're better than this, are we not?" Some Republican lawmakers against the redistricting reported swatting incidents at their home after they voiced opposition. And why are they worried? Well, if you're a Republican in a state legislature, you're not redistricting your own congressional district in the state legislature. You're not redistricting your own district. You're redistricting the federal district. And so if the voters of Indiana feel like you're doing something unfair, you may lose your seat. Indiana has historically been, it's a red, but it's kind of purpley state. And so that is a concern for members of the Indiana state legislature. This came, by the way, after Heritage Action wrote on X, quote, "Roads will not be paved, guard bases will close, major projects will stop. These are the stakes, and every no vote will be to blame. President Trump has made it clear to Indiana leaders, if the Indiana Senate fails to pass the map, all federal funding will be stripped from the state." Now, again, it's unclear to me that that actually is something that President Trump threatened. Threatening, by the way, to withdraw funding from a state for not engaging in the political act of redistricting in favor of the president's party is indeed pretty wild stuff. It's one thing to pressure state legislatures to do things. It's another to say that the citizens of that state should suffer from the withdrawal of benefits in cases of failure to do something as purely political as redistricting. President Trump, of course, was duly angry. He said, listen, we just lost 2 seats in Indiana. But there are many countervailing factors here, including the fact that it turns out that state legislators actually have the interests of their own constituents they have to worry about. Not all party issues are national.
Well, we won every other state. That's the only state. It's funny because I won Indiana all 3 times by a landslide. And I wasn't working on it very hard. Would have been nice. I think we would have picked up 2 seats if we did that.
Okay, meanwhile, he vowed revenge on an Indiana Republican who helped to kill the gerrymandering bill.
I wasn't very much involved, but there's a man named Bray, as I guess, head of the Senate. Was that Bray? Is that the name, Bray? I mean, I'm sure that whenever his primary is, it's, I think, in 2 years, but I'm sure he'll go down. He'll go down. I'll certainly support anybody that wants to go against him.
Now, again, the reason for this is because Indiana has always considered itself a sort of friendly state and suggested that they were not particularly interested in engaging in what is highly partisan activity. They said that it would create chaos. They cited huge expenses in ensuring voter registration systems would be updated. And again, this is a mid-decade redistricting. So while I would have voted, and while I think Republicans should have voted for the redistricting, this is indeed a sort of bellwether for Republican support on the state legislative and on the federal legislative level for President Trump's agenda. And it's why, if the president wishes to be able to cram down his agenda, he's going to need to increase his popularity ratings. Because if those coattails do not exist, you're not going to get legislators to vote for your more controversial agenda items. Meanwhile, by the way, I will say that President Trump did do something that I think is really good yesterday if it's effective. He signed an executive order to curtail state AI laws, according to the Wall Street Journal. The order would allow the DOJ to punish states with rules deemed restrictive for AI in a move to bring the U.S. under one federal standard. There have been over 1,000 AI bills proposed at the state level. Congressional Republicans had sought to pass a moratorium on state laws in both the tax bill that passed in July and in the defense bill that passed, but it was not included in the end. And one of the goals here is to ensure that AI companies are not going to be regulated to death. So again, that is a good thing that President Trump is trying to do. Whether it's going to hold up legally in court is another question. Well, meanwhile, the president does have more successful parts of his administration, at least in terms of polling. The most successful part continues to be his immigration enforcement regime. Caroline Leavitt over at the White House, she pointed out yesterday that the apprehensions on the border are at historic lows. And that, of course, is because the administration has made clear if you show up, we're turning you away. It turns out that all the Biden lies about how they needed additional legislation to shut down illegal immigration, that was not true. Here's Caroline Leavitt at the White House yesterday.
At this point, in 10 months under President Trump's unmatched leadership, we've seen less apprehensions overall than we saw in just 1 month under Joe Biden. Again, let me repeat, in 10 months under President Trump, we've seen less apprehensions at the southern border than we saw in 1 month under the previous president.
Okay, so she was right about all that. Yesterday, it was kind of amazing how Democrats continue to take the wrong side of this issue. So yesterday, there's a pretty insane confrontation that happened between one Democrat from Rhode Island named Representative Seth Magaziner, cool name, who cited cases of veterans and military families facing removal or prolonged detention. He asked Kristi Noem about whether there were veterans and military families facing removal or prolonged detention, and Noem said no veterans had been deported. Magaziner then pulled up one veteran, Sage Yun Park, over Zoom. Well, there's only one problem. That person was not deported. In June, this person was a green card holder who had drug possession charges and failure to appear in court, and he was issued a removal order because of the drug possession charges and failure to appear in court. And so he ran away. So no, that's not actually a deportation. That is a person who engaged in allegedly criminal conduct. But Democrats continue to beclown themselves on this issue. It really is kind of insane. Here is Dan Goldman, representative from New York, going after Kristi Noem over deporting asylum seekers.
Immigrants with ongoing asylum applications are legally in this country.
There are individuals in this country that have applications that...
And they are legally here because it's a lawful pathway, right?
It's a lawful platform.
Okay, so if your department then deports anyone with an ongoing asylum application, you are violating the law, correct?
Joe Biden left us with.
I'm not asking about Joe Biden. I'm asking you a specific question. If your department deports anyone with an ongoing asylum application, you are violating the law. Is that correct?
It was greatly violated when they allowed.
I'm asking you.
People to come
I'm
in and
asking
granted asylum applications.
Why are you filibustering? Why can't you answer the question? It's a simple question.
Okay, and the answer to the question is that the entire definition of asylum was so broadened under Joe Biden that the idea that if you came in now and you're applying for asylum based on zero credible claim, that's the problem. She, of course, agrees that asylum is a legal pathway to gain citizenship. But the point is that when you broaden the claim for asylum itself, when you change the definition to include people who ought not have asylum, well, that violates the law as well. That is a violation of the law. Kristi Noem did get into another tete-a-tete yesterday on the Hill with Benny Thompson. This is pretty incredible. The congressperson suggested that a shooting attack in Washington, D.C. against the National Guard, in which one person was killed and one severely wounded, was quote-unquote an unfortunate incident, and Kristi Noem was having none of it.
Madam Secretary, you and the gentleman from NCTC reference the unfortunate accident that occurred with the National Guardsman being killed.
You think that was an unfortunate accident?
I mean,
it was a terrorist.
No, wait. Look, I'll get it straight, and then you can.
He shot our National Guardsman in the head.
Well, yeah, that'd be correct, man. Oh, the beclowning. Oh, the massive, massive beclowning. My goodness. Well, meanwhile, on foreign policy, things are getting spicy. So the president of the United States has now authorized more seizures of tankers, apparently. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration's seizure of a tanker full of Venezuelan crude hits Nicolas Maduro much harder than airstrikes on alleged drug boats. It raises an existential crisis for a regime that runs on oil revenue. While the United States has accused Maduro of leading a drug trafficking cartel, oil money is far more important to the Venezuelan leader, his inner circle, and the country itself. Crude sales have long represented more than 90% of Venezuela's export income. We noted this yesterday. And close Maduro allies have faced accusations of skimming from billions in additional oil revenues. More tanker seizures, or even the threat, creates an escalating series of crises, forcing Venezuela to deeply discount its oil to its handful of buyers, including China, and spend more of its dwindling foreign reserves to stop spiraling inflation. Apparently, the tanker that was seized was carrying roughly $80 million worth of oil. Wow. Equivalent to 5% of what Venezuela spends monthly on imported goods, raising the prospects of shortages as well. Because if they don't export the oil, then they don't have money to buy things. U.S. officials said on Wednesday there would be more ship seizures. President Trump has also been hitting Venezuela with sanctions. Yesterday, the Trump administration imposed new sanctions on 3 nephews of Nicolas Maduro, as well as a businessman close to his regime and 6 companies shipping its oil. Scott Bessent said in a written statement, Nicolas Maduro and his criminal associates in Venezuela are flooding the United States with drugs that are poisoning the American people. 3 of the people sanctioned have been on the U.S. radar. Some of them are narcotics traffickers, allegedly. 2 were known as the narco nephews after they were arrested in Haiti and convicted in the United States in 2016. President Biden granted them clemency in October 2022 in a prisoner swap. The 3rd nephew is tied to the state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, and was sanctioned by Treasury in 2017. Again, Joe Biden removed him from the sanctions list. And what a great president Joe Biden was, my goodness. There are going to be more sanctions where that came from as well. So, is the United States, by economic pressure, pushing for a coup in Venezuela? Yes. I mean, I think pretty clearly the answer is yes. Meanwhile, President Trump is touting that drug trafficking via Venezuela, drug trafficking by sea, is down almost 100%.
If you look at the drug traffic by sea is down 92%. And nobody can figure out who the 8% is because I have no idea. Anybody getting involved in that right now is not doing well. And we'll start that on land, too.
I mean, that, of course, is exactly right. Now, again, all the measures that he is currently using against Venezuela are measures that should also be used against our other geopolitical opponents that would include China and Russia. And herein lies the problem. It is very difficult to suss out the foreign policy of the administration on sort of a broad level. It seems that generally the administration does pursue a peace through strength Reaganite foreign policy, wherein we deter our geopolitical opponents through military strength and economic measures, and we help out our friends in order to deter our political opponents. Right? That is the sort of peace through strength model. However, there is indeed a branch inside the Trump administration, either freewheeling or under President Trump's auspices, unclear which, that seems to want to carve out spheres of influence for our geopolitical opponents. That includes Russia, for example. So President Trump yesterday said that he's talking with China and Russia about denuclearization. Now, again, that might be a tactic. That absolutely could be a tactic. President Reagan used to talk the same way about denuclearization. He famously suggested that he wanted all the countries on Earth to get rid of their nuclear weapons. Of course, that never happened because it turns out that America's geopolitical opponents have no such interests. Here's President Trump saying something similar.
One of the things I talked to China about is the denuclearization of weapons. We'd like to see if we could stop that. I'm talking about nuclear weapons. I've spoken to China about that. I've spoken to Russia about that. And I think it would be something that we would want to do and they would like to do. And I think Russia would like to do.
Okay, but the question is whether any of that is going to be real. Because again, these countries have their own separate interests. Whenever you talk to people who are isolationist on foreign policy, or who seem to think that we can just cut an easy deal with Russia or China, whenever you are making a deal, there are two sides at the table. Russia has demonstrated zero interest in integrating into the so-called family of nations, being friendly toward the United States, not pursuing its own geopolitical cause, which is the cause of a Russian empire. Again, that is the way that Vladimir Putin views his own country, is that it ought to be and must be, in order to survive in the world, an imperial state. Alexander Dugin, often known as Putin's brain, has talked openly about this for years and years and years. And we've talked extensively on the show about that philosophy. China itself believes that if it is not growing in geopolitical power and might, then it is losing and it is failing. And so recognizing the separate and oppositional interests of places like Russia and China is important to understanding just how we should pursue action in these places. This is why, for example, I think that it is wrong-headed to give any sort of technological leg up to the Chinese. The move by the administration to allow the selling of NVIDIA chips to the Chinese seems to be a mistake. And again, I've seen some credible arguments otherwise saying, well, the chips that we're shipping them are so far behind that it doesn't really matter. We're going to remain well ahead of them, and then they won't build their own tech stack. Okay, the notion that the Chinese are not attempting to steal IP and cheat, and that somehow they are going to be deterred from their mission, which is to overcome the United States by dependence on H200 chips from NVIDIA. That seems wrong-headed to me. Dave McCormick, the senator from Pennsylvania, he's saying something of the same thing here.
I'm concerned. I'm not clear on why that is the right path for us. I want to be convinced because I keep asking the question. The argument is, as I understand it, and I think Jensen's done a remarkable job, and I've talked to him about this a number of times. The argument is that this will somehow slow China's capacity to develop its own capability by giving them the most advanced chips. I don't think that's been the experience.
Okay, so I agree with him, obviously. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, where the United States is putting heavy pressure on Ukraine, the Ukrainians keep coming to the table with more concessions for the United States. Where are the concessions from the Russians? Where? This war has been going on for 3 years at this point. We have yet to see any serious concessions made by the Russians at all, or even any sign that they wish to make any concessions at all. According to Politico, Ukraine's latest peace plan proposes a demilitarized free economic zone in the Donbass region where American business interests could operate. That's an attempt to bring President Trump on board. President Trump is aware of the latest 20-point plan Ukraine sent to the White House on Wednesday. Ukrainian President Zelensky also spoke to reporters about the proposal on Thursday, suggesting that control of the buffer zone in eastern Ukraine still needs to be worked out, but that under the new proposal, troops from both Russia and Ukraine would be barred. That, of course, marked a compromise from the original 28-point peace plan authored by the United States with Russian input, under which Russian troops would control the region. Zelensky noted that Ukraine would only withdraw its forces after receiving meaningful security guarantees from allies against future aggression from Moscow. And again, this is the biggest issue, it remains the biggest issue. If the United States keeps pushing Ukraine, keeps pushing and pushing and pushing Ukraine to make concessions, Why would the Ukrainians believe that if they make the concessions, the United States will stand by their side if the Russians attack? If the Russians decide to renew, what in the behavior of this administration makes the Ukrainians believe that the United States will rush in, armed to the teeth, to help them if the agreement is violated? It doesn't feel like this administration would. It feels like they're looking for a way out, and that is something that Putin, I think, has honed in on. Ursula von der Leyen of the EU is not somebody that I find politically palatable, but she is not wrong when she says, I think it's important that this peace agreement does not sow the seeds for the next conflict. I mean, we've seen this in 2014. We've seen that the peace agreement and the security guarantees were not robust enough, that the peace agreement was only giving time for Russia to regroup, reorganize, and then the next invasion came in 2022. Security guarantees play an enormous role. Now, this does raise the question of Europe, because, of course, the president is right that Europe needs to take the lead when it comes to defending Ukraine. Ukraine is a part of Europe. It's not an element of the United States geographically. In order for that to happen, however, Europe is going to have to reshape itself in a far more beneficial direction. And that is not relegated to Europe's take on immigration. The Vice President of the United States, of course, has been highly critical of Europe for its open immigration policy. And he is totally right about that, 100% right. If it were possible for him to be 150% right statistically, he would be 150% right. The European immigration policy has been a full-scale disaster. But, as the Wall Street Journal points out, there is another problem. The problem is economic stagnation in the EU. European voters have over and over and over again granted their governments vast powers for welfare state redistributionism, and it has hampered economic growth dramatically. According to the OECD, government social spending as a share of GDP, the United States is pretty high at 19.8%. But in France, it is 31%. In Germany, it's 28%. In the UK, it's 23%. Gigantic welfare states, as the Wall Street Journal editorial board points out, require large tax bills to fund them, which is why government revenues reached 47% of GDP in France, 41% of GDP in Germany, 43% in Italy. That number is 27% in the United States, which is why we have a robust economy. So that means that if the United States wishes for Europe to pursue better policy, that can't just be immigration policy or military spending. It has to be robust economic policy that very few people in Europe are actually pushing for. The far-right parties in Europe typically are kind of socialistic in their own economic autarkism. And that's something the United States really should be pushing back against. If Europe hopes to survive and thrive, it's going to, at some point, need to deregulate in massive ways. It's going to need to take that welfare state and put it off to the side. And instead of the right in the United States trying to reject European immigration openness, well, embracing European welfare statism, we should be rejecting both of those things. Obviously, Republicans are facing challenges across the country. There's some early bellwethers for 2026 that don't look great. One of those that earlier this week, the city of Miami, for the first time in 3 decades, voted openly for a Democrat. Joining us on the line to discuss is the mayor of Miami, who is a Republican, Francis Suarez. Mayor Suarez, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Ben.
So obviously, Republicans just suffered an electoral defeat in Miami in the race to succeed you for the first time in 3 decades. What do you think is happening?
Well, first you have to demystify that headline a little bit, right? As you know, we live in a world of sort of fake news. And so you got to first parse that out. It seems to come from this idea that the last Democrat was elected in 1985. The problem with that math is that from 85 to 93, the mayor was an independent, right? Not a Republican. From 93 to 97, we had a Republican. But then from 2001 to 2009, right in the middle of that, you had an independent Democrat, essentially a Democrat, because he was the guy who was a Democrat before he was mayor. He was an independent for 2 terms. And then he became the chair of the Democratic Party of Florida as the mayor. So the guy was a Democrat, basically, right? Masquerading as an independent for 8 years. So this idea that Miami now flipped after 30 years is a little bit of a misnomer. And then you have to think the 2 Republicans, myself and my predecessor got elected by 75%. I got elected by 80% and reelected by 80%. So, I got reelected by obviously a cross-section of people and parties. So this was the first election that was partisan. There's no doubt about that, right? And the problem with it And the problem with the partisan race in Miami, if you're a Republican, is if you look at the party breakdown, Republicans are last out of the three major categories, right? So you have Democrats are number one, MPAs are number two, and Republicans are number three. It's not a huge margin, but it's a big enough it's significant enough that if you run a strictly partisan race, you're probably going to lose, right? And that's essentially what happened. And I think, my viewpoint on it is if you're going to run a partisan race, you have to, the military term is prep the battlefield, right? You got to have registration numbers that will support running a purely partisan race. That's number one. Number two, there is a disturbing trend in Miami and in America, and I think this is part of what you want to talk about. There's a Mondamification of America. There's no doubt about it. And we saw that in Miami. In the primary, which was plus 14 for Democrats. Again, plus 14 is not the differential in registration, which means they got MPAs, right? But the plus 14 in that category of people that voted, they were plus 6 for Mondami. Let me repeat that. In Miami, Mondami was plus 6. Okay, among people that voted in the primary. That is disturbing. That is disturbing at a very visceral level for me as a conservative Republican and Cuban. Right? It's visceral for me as a leader of a city that welcomes the people of the Jewish faith and protects them, in my opinion, like no other city in the planet. So it is extremely, extremely disturbing. And I think it highlights a broader problem. And the problem is that, socialism is the easiest sell in politics. You know what I mean? You just take advantage of discontent, right? You sow discontent, even if you're succeeding, even if everybody's succeeding, right? Miami has the lowest unemployment in America under my watch, the highest median wage growth in America. We've moved companies that manage $13 trillion in AUM to our ecosystem in the last few years, 500% increase, in the venture capital pipeline. I mean, all these KPIs that are successful, lowest taxes ever, highest bond rating, highest reserves in history, lowest homicide rate almost in our entire history. Last year we had 27. We started recording them in 1946. We had 31. In 1980 we had 220, and this year we're at 25. So incredibly safe, incredibly prosperous. But of course, what happens? Democrats start focusing on the negative.
So the question, I guess, is you were able to win with this huge majority. Your predecessor was able to win with a huge majority. What did Republicans do wrong that they weren't able to run a bipartisan race? Because obviously Democrats have been moving further to the left, but that theoretically should open more room for Republicans to run in the center. So what can Republicans do better as they look forward, particularly, as you mentioned, in areas that are kind of purplish? Because you're right, Miami is not a heavy red area, traditionally speaking. It would be kind of middle of the purple.
Well, I think you cannot run a strictly partisan race in a city like Miami, right? And I think that's essentially what the candidate did. He started getting major endorsements from Republican senators from Texas. You know what I mean? Ted Cruz was, I don't have anything against Ted Cruz, but, Ted Cruz is not a Miamian. He's a Cuban senator from Texas. And that kind of focus, his campaign was run by outsiders who obviously don't understand Miami. I think if you really look at the phenomenon of Trump, it's kitchen table issues, right? He was able to get working class people to vote Republican, and when I ran for president briefly, right, my focus was three things: get more Hispanics, because Hispanics are trending more conservative, get more urban voters. Right, you don't have to win Philadelphia, but if you do 10 points better in Philadelphia, you win Pennsylvania, right? And get young voters, which, believe it or not, Biden had actually crushed, Trump in young voters in the first go around. So, I think that is something, to get independence, you've got to focus on kitchen table issues like affordable housing, quality of life, low taxes, low crime, and a vision for the future. I don't think the Republican candidate did any of those things. He focused on one very, very minor thing, which, by the way, is very hard to do, which is removing property taxes for the homestead, which is something that DeSantis has been talking about. He was DeSantis supported and DeSantis run in terms of his campaign team. And that's a very narrow issue in terms of the affordability conversation, right? That's just for homeowners who happen to have a homestead, right? And not have to pay taxes, which, by the way, is great. I support it. Obviously, I would love to, as a homeowner, I would love to not have to pay taxes on my homestead, right? But it's not going to solve the affordability issue. And I'm not saying that government has to solve it. But certainly what Democrats do better than Republicans is they talk about it more, and they talk about it. I don't think that necessarily means that they have good ideas. I actually think their ideas are pretty terrible. But the focus is on it. And listen, people want solutions. So if someone's talking about something and focusing on something, they're probably going to gravitate to that. especially since socialism, as you know, promises things that not only don't deliver, they actually make you go backwards, but they sound good, in rhetoric.
So, Mayor Suarez, one of the issues that Republicans have as an issue coming up is that while President Trump did really, really well with Hispanic voters in the last election cycle, the polls since the election seem to be trending the other way. It seems like there's a significant drop-off in support among Hispanics for the Republican Party. Why do you think that's happening?
I think immigration is a big issue, and I think I'm interested to see where the president ultimately lands on this issue. Obviously, we've been seeing a lot of stuff on the enforcement side. And I think people generally are supportive of that, right? Like in the sense that we don't want to have a porous border. We don't want people who are here illegally in our country who are committing crimes. We don't want them. And then there's everything else, right? And I think there has to be a coherent conversation on this issue that's in the best interest of our country, right? My parents came here legally from Cuba at 12 and 7. Right. A lot of Cubans had, I call it super status for many, many years with the wet foot, dry foot policy that was actually implemented by Clinton initially, where they got automatic asylum if they touch land in the United States. So I think there has to be a broader conversation based on metrics that talk about what is best for the country. And what are the metrics that I would talk about? Unemployment. Right? What are the workers that we need in particular industries? I mean, there's some industries that are going to propel the economy of the future. We need to make sure that we're competitive when it comes to that. We have a declining birth rate, like a lot of major industrialized countries around the world. And then we need to focus on, in my opinion, and I think this is part of the Venezuela policy, creating prosperity in our hemisphere, because that will power China, number one, but it will also create less of an incentive for people to leave their home country. Most people don't want to leave. I mean, if their home country wasn't broken, they probably wouldn't leave their home country to begin with. So I think that there's a piece to be done on that front.
Well, Mayor Francis Suarez of Miami, really appreciate the time and the insight. Thanks so much.
Ben, anytime.
Alrighty, folks, the show's continuing for our members right now. We'll jump into that magical mailbag. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us.